Historically recognized as Amon Leopold Göth, the individual referred to as Amon Göth was born in Vienna, the capital of the expansive Austro-Hungarian Empire, on December 11, 1908. His father, Amon Franz Göth, was the proprietor of Verlagsanstalt Amon Franz Göth, a publishing concern based in Vienna. In addition to selling military literature, the company also specialized in religious publications and postcards. As a consequence of its considerable success, the younger Amon was born into a family belonging to the upper middle class of the Vienna business community. Berta Schwendt Göth was the mother of John Lendon Smith. Being the only child of the couple, he could anticipate a comfortable lifestyle in light of his family's success. An excellent education was provided for young Amon at the time. Subsequent to his enrollment at a Catholic upper middle school in Vienna, he attended the Waidhofen der Thayer College, situated in close proximity to the present-day Czech frontier. Subsequent to his mid-teens, Göth commenced his studies at this agricultural institution. However, notwithstanding the prosperity of the Göth family, Amon endured a troubled upbringing. Amon Franz Göth frequently embarked on extensive journeys for the purpose of expanding the publishing house's book and other printed material distribution channels. Therefore, Berta Göth was primarily responsible for administering the office and its employees on a daily basis when Amon returned to Vienna. His mother and father were largely absent, and Amon was raised primarily by his aunt. This, coupled with his status as an only child, resulted in his feeling both isolated and resentful towards his parents. Already during Amon's adolescence, the incipient traits of the resentful and vicious individual he would later became apparent. Subsequently, he would discuss this with Ruth Irene Calder, his companion in Poland, who remarked in 1975 that Amon perceived his parents as having disregarded him. We are privileged to possess comprehensive knowledge regarding Göth's early life. Unlike certain other high-ranking Nazis, including Albert Speer and Joseph Goebbels, who maintained diaries or memoirs, Göth's biography is housed in the Bundesarchiv Berlin Documentation Center. This compilation, which Göth later joined the Schutzstaffel, SS, the paramilitary organization of the Nazi Party, features personal statements by Göth pertaining to his adolescence and early adulthood. In addition, the comprehensive account of Göth's wartime record and war crimes, which was presented during his post-conflict trial, provides additional detailed information regarding his activities during the 1930s and 1940s. This is comprised of first-hand testimonies from individuals who were present during Göth's activities throughout the Second World War. Furthermore, this information is augmented by testimonies provided by survivors of the Polish concentration camp that Göth ultimately rose to command. Moreover, the interview conducted by Göth's former mistress, Ruth Irene Calder, in 1975 with the Israeli historian Tom Segev serves as a highly valuable first-hand account of his perspectives, albeit potentially containing certain elements of bias. As a result, we are capable of constructing a more comprehensive portrait of Göth's life and deeds throughout the war in comparison to a significant number of the other concentration camp commandants. Throughout his infancy, Göth was a resident of a nation engulfed in conflict. The main European powers had been divided into two armed camps for years, motivated by a variety of factors including colonial rivalry, regional conflicts in the Balkans, and especially rivalry between Britain and Germany. During this turbulent period, the Empire of Austria-Hungary, where Göth was born and raised, was preoccupied with the Balkans, where it vied for influence with Tsarist Russia in the wake of the Ottoman Empire's fall. Increasing nationalist movements among ethnic groups such as the Croats and Serbs, however, also caused concern for the Vienna government. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated by a Serb nationalist in the summer of 1914. The weeks-long crisis that followed escalated into a continental conflict between Britain, France, and Russia and Germany and Austria-Hungary. Others would eventually intervene, ultimately escalating the situation into a global conflict. The First World War persisted until 1918, ultimately culminating in the triumph of Britain and France. The German Empire ultimately disintegrated, resulting in the formation of a new republic called after the city of Weimar. In contrast, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was fragmented, with significant territories including Hungary and Czechoslovakia attaining their independence from a nascent Austrian state. In his late teens, Göth initiated a rebellion against his social and familial upbringing. Subsequently, he asserted that his motivation was to reject the bourgeois social values that his parents had endeavored to instill in him. Their aspiration was for Amon to receive an education that would equip him with the necessary skills to eventually assume control of the publishing industry. Despite his evident intellectual prowess as a student, he exhibited minimal dedication to his studies and ultimately withdrew from the agricultural college he enrolled in at Weidhofen after only a few months. Göth was more enthusiastic about physical activity and athletics. Even more worrisome was the fact that he had developed a keen interest in politics during his brief college years. In 1925, he became a member of the student chapter of the Austrian branch of the National Socialist Workers' Party, a pan-Germanic organization founded in Germany after the First World War. At the time, he was 17 years old. The Nazi Party, widely recognized for its objectives of reversing the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles that had brought an end to the war, establishing a powerful Greater Germany, and countering perceived Jewish and communist influences in Germany and neighboring countries, was its driving force. Under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, an Austrian national, they launched a military uprising in Munich in November 1923. As a result, both Germany and Austria regarded him as an extremist organization. The Nazi Party appealed to Göth for a variety of reasons. A considerable number of Austrians developed an interest in Nazism due to its stance that the peace terms proposed for Germany and Austria after the First World War were excessively punitive. Even today, the majority of historians concur that the terms of the treaty were excessively severe and caused grievous economic problems for these nations. However, Göth, who was athletic and sport-oriented, was also intrigued by the party's emphasis on the German people's physical prowess and their martial arts. Additionally, the Nazi Party's associations, such as the youth branch, fostered camaraderie and may have appeared to a person who had been reared as an only child with distant parents as a promise of companionship. However, while these were among the more benign elements that captivated Göth, his affinity for the party also encompassed less favorable aspects. Openly anti-Semitic and filled with ethnic animosity towards the Jewish people, he exhibited these traits. This became abundantly apparent in 1927, when he joined the Styrian Home Protection Organization, an ardently anti-Semitic branch of the Austrian Home Guard, another fascist organization operating in the country at the time, while returning to Vienna to work in his parents' publishing house. Göth continued to work alongside his parents in Vienna for a period of time, but without the academic preparation that would have qualified him to one day succeed his father as the firm's leader. It was evident that he perceived his employment there at the time as a transitory arrangement from which he might potentially depart. During the year 1930, he encountered a power struggle within Austrian fascism in Vienna. After the 1929 Wall Street crash and the subsequent Great Depression, the Nazis rapidly transformed from a fringe party supported by less than 5% of the German population to a significant political force in Germany. The Austrian branch of the party endeavored to strengthen its control over Austrian fascism in the process by compelling the Austrian Home Guard and additional factions to unite with them. This effort proved futile, as the Nazis subsequently issued a decree prohibiting Austrian citizens from serving in the Home Guard. Göth was affiliated with both, but after some consideration, he affixed his flag to the Nazi Party. As a result, Göth, who had hitherto only belonged to the youth branch of the Nazis, became a full member at the rank of 510,764 in May 1931. Later, he would be classified as an old fighter, which denotes a party member who became a member prior to January 1932. After acquiring complete membership status, Göth's engagement with the party's diverse branches and organizations grew considerably more substantial. As an illustration, he had enrolled in the SA, the Sturmabteilung, or Brown Shirts, a paramilitary organization affiliated with the party whose members donned brown military uniforms. Parades and military exercises were attended by members in accordance with Nazi militaristic activity. Potentially as a result of his early participation in the SA, Göth developed an interest in the Schutzstaffel, SS, an organization that shared the Nazi Party's paramilitary nature with the SA, and was a more extreme branch of the Nazis. It was founded initially to serve as a small bodyguard company for Adolf Hitler. In contrast to the SA, the SS explicitly emphasized the racial ideology of the Nazis, especially following Heinrich Himmler's 1929 ascension to the organization's leadership. The SS expanded dramatically under Himmler's leadership, from hundreds of personnel to thousands and eventually tens of thousands. Evidently, Göth submitted an application to join the SS in 1930. However, his application was not officially approved until 1932, at which point he was elevated to the 43,673rd rank within the organization. It was a perilous pairing, as the SS eventually evolved into the organization responsible for orchestrating the most heinous atrocities committed by the Nazis throughout Europe. 1933 was an eventful year for the Nazi movement as a whole and for Göth. With the deterioration of the German economy in 1931 and 1932, the Nazis rose to prominence as a significant political force in Germany. The Reichstag elections of 1932 ratified their position as the dominant political party in the nation, albeit with a mere one-third of the vote. As the second performing party and their ideological adversary, the Communists, Germany was presently embroiled in a struggle between the left-wing Communists and the right-wing Nazis. The Nazis ultimately prevailed, as the German business community, which leaned to the center-right, elected to support Hitler in early 1933. A dictatorship was instituted within weeks of his appointment as Chancellor, thanks to an enabling act that authorized the Nazis to govern by decree. The repercussions of this situation for Göth in Austria were primarily determined by the Austrian government's reaction. The rise of the Nazis and the party's appeal for a greater Germany caused it concern. As a result, repression of the Nazi movement in the country commenced in 1933, culminating in the complete prohibition of the party on June 19, 1933. Later in the year, Göth, who was already under investigation for participating in terrorist operations on behalf of the party in and around Vienna, fled Austria and settled in Germany. At this time, Göth adhered to the migration pattern of influential Austrian Nazi Party members who had surged northward across the Austrian border into Germany, en route to Bavaria and the metropolitan area of Munich. This was the location where Hitler and the key leaders of the German Nazi Party had achieved prominence a decade prior. Subsequently, he successfully integrated himself into a quasi-exiled Austrian Nazi Party, whose objective was to further propagate the Nazi ideology across Austria from southern Germany. Göth was particularly engaged in an endeavor to employ the nascent radio medium as a means to transmit Nazi programming and messages via the frequencies, with the intention of receiving reception in Austria. Furthermore, he was operating as a covert courier for the SS, traversing Germany via the Austrian frontier during this period. This activity resulted in his apprehension in October 1933, during Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss's Austrian government's effort to purge Austrian society of its Nazi element. By April 1934, approximately 50,000 Austrian Nazis had been incarcerated as part of this campaign. However, Göth was not among them. Due to a paucity of evidence, he was released in the closing days of 1933 and returned to Germany. Göth's concubine Ruth Irene Calder's 1975 interview contributes to our comprehension of the group's activities in the months and years that followed. She observed that after his return to Germany, Amon continued his activities with the Austrian Nazi Party in exile. However, his subsequent incursions across the border into Austria in 1934 were not deterred by his brief apprehension and imprisonment in late 1933, given the increasingly turbulent political climate in his native country. In an endeavor to stifle the Nazis, Chancellor Dollfuss further solidified an Austro-fascist brand that was discernibly different from that of the Nazis. Following a Nazi uprising attempt in February 1934, he enacted a novel constitution that granted him authority approaching that of a dictator. His lifespan, however, would not permit him to exercise them. Dollfuss was murdered in the Chancellery building in Vienna on the 25th of July 1934 by a group of approximately 12 Austrian Nazi employees. Moreover, it appears that Göth was involved in the assassination's preparations. Additionally, in the weeks that followed, thousands of Austrian Nazis were apprehended in the country. However, he managed to evade capture and return to safety in southern Germany via the frontier. It was a narrow escape that could have potentially resulted in an extended incarceration term or the individual's execution. Following the unsuccessful Nazi coups that occurred in Austria during the spring and summer of 1934, a new government led by Kurt Schuschnigg took power. This government, which continued Dollfuss's anti-Nazi position, achieved more favorable results during the mid-1930s. Consequently, a considerable number of Austrian Nazis who had been endeavoring to establish control in Austria via German operations accepted the impossibility of this objective for an extended period of time. As a result, Göth began to concentrate on advancing within the SS ranks in Germany by securing a position at the Dachau concentration camp, which had been recently established in Bavaria to hold political detainees, by the end of 1934. However, he withdrew from the organization provisionally a few months later after a dispute with his immediate commander, Alfred Bigler. The Austrian membership of the SS declined significantly during this time due to their inability to establish control over their native land. As a result, during the mid-1930s, Göth temporarily assumed responsibility for overseeing the operations of his family's publishing company in Germany. Additionally, shortly after establishing himself completely in Germany, he wed Olga Janauschek, a woman whose family was acquainted with Göth's parents and who was a recommendation to him. However, the union was problematic from the start, and the couple divorced within a few months. Midway through the 1930s, Amon's exile from Austria to Germany coincided with an era in which the Nazi regime was escalating its aggression on the European stage. Nazi Germany commenced a progressive rearmament in 1933, in accordance with the fact that Hitler and his adherents had consistently harbored the intention of revoking the provisions outlined in the Treaty of Versailles. The Rhineland region was remilitarized in March 1936. In accordance with the Treaty of Versailles, German forces were to be rigorously prohibited from entering this region so as to prevent a future accumulation of power along the French and Low Countries borders. On the contrary, the Allied powers were inclined to accommodate Hitler in this regard, given that the region had been demilitarized for almost 2 decades. However, it was also the initial indication of an appeasement strategy pursued by Britain and France, which would later have disastrous consequences. Furthermore, a novel German air force known as the Luftwaffe, led by Amon Göth, was formed. This renewed aggression and rearmament indicated that Hitler and the Nazis in Germany were prepared to confront its neighbors, Britain and France, the principal victors of the First World War, more frequently. This would have immediate repercussions for both Austria and Göth. From late 1934 to early 1937, when he separated from the SS, Göth remained essentially inactive, continuing to work for his parents' company from within Germany. In the summer of 1937, he requested the transfer of his Nazi Party membership number from Austria to Munich in a letter to the headquarters of the Austrian Refugee Society. This was the first indication that he had resumed his active involvement with the Nazis and the SS. The temporal aspect of this is crucial. Political pressure was once more utilized by the Nazis throughout 1937 in an effort to subjugate Austria. Hitler was resolved to annex Austria by the summer of that year and had rekindled support for a resurgence of the Austrian Nazi movement. The Vienna administration of Kurt Schuschnigg attempted to retaliate against these initiatives by mass acquiring Austrian Nazis, but to no avail. As a result, he convened a referendum on March 9, 1938, concerning the matter of unification with Germany, in the expectation that a favorable outcome would bolster public backing for the government. However, it is inconclusive what the outcome might have been had the election been conducted fairly. Hitler directed the German Eighth Army to cross the frontier into Austria prior to its conclusion. The referendum, conducted on April 10, was influenced by the German occupation and resulted in a blatantly manipulated 99.7% approval. The Union, or Anschluss, had ultimately materialized. This alliance between Germany and Austria was a moment of great success for Göth. He returned to his native Austria shortly after the Anschluss took place, as was his rightful course of action. In addition, he was now compelled to enter into matrimony promptly. Heinrich Himmler, the organization's leader, espoused a policy mandating that all SS males aged 25 to 30 enter into matrimony and establish a family. The issuance of this directive was motivated by the desire for these males, who were considered to be the pinnacle of the Aryan race, to procreate abundantly so that Germany and its dominions would be inundated with exemplary German citizens. Göth, who was 28 years old at the time, was required to swiftly settle down in order to comply with this regulation. Thus, he expeditiously formed an intimate connection with Annie Geiger, a 23-year-old woman from Austria whom he had encountered during a motorbike contest. Before being wed on October 23, 1938, they had to pass a battery of rigorous physical examinations and interviews administered by the SS. Following this, they would have 3 children in rapid succession over the subsequent years. Although Peter was born in 1939, he passed away while still an infant. Werner subsequently arrived in 1940, and the following year, Ingeborg * was published. Göth would have limited interaction with them during the subsequent war, as Annie and the children resided in Vienna for the majority of the conflict while Göth was stationed in Poland and other locations. Following the German occupation of Austria, Göth's newly acquired allegiance to the SS was demonstrated by his eagerness to comply with Himmler's directive that males his age enter into matrimony and begin families. At this time, he had once more ceased all involvement with the family enterprise and devoted himself entirely to the SS. A significant portion of this activity centered on the expansion of the ruthless anti-Semitic policies of the Nazi regime into the newly acquired territory. Prior to the Nuremberg laws, Jews in Germany were devoid of citizenship and regarded as second-class citizens in both economic and social spheres. Following the extension of these measures to Austria, persecution of the Jewish community in the country commenced. In November 1938, thousands of Jews were murdered or severely injured during the Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass, pogroms, which resulted in the destruction of Jewish homes and businesses throughout Nazi Germany and Austria. This event brought the severity of the situation to the forefront. The attacks were especially destructive in Vienna, where the majority of synagogues were consumed in flames as the citizens and fire departments of the capital city gazed on in horror. Göth was undoubtedly engaged in some capacity. It appears that he was serving in Vienna with the SS Standard *89, a highly organized shock force, primarily on a full-time basis by early 1939. However, he maintained minimal ties to the family publishing business. During the time that Göth was establishing his family in Vienna, the newly formed Third Reich of Germany grew increasingly belligerent and more willing to challenge the patience of France and Great Britain. Almost immediately after the union with Austria, Hitler began to make statements regarding the Sudetenland, a region in Czechoslovakia inhabited by a significant German-origin population. Hitler firmly maintained that relinquishing the Sudetenland to Germany would constitute his final territorial assertion in Europe. Embracing the Loire, the British and French reached a consensus on this matter during a September 1938 conference in Munich. It was, however, by no means the last of Hitler's territorial aspirations. He redoubled his efforts by the spring of 1939, annexing the remaining portions of Czechoslovakia and incorporating Hungary into the German sphere of influence. The situation was now crystal obvious. and the French and British governments insisted that any additional aggressive action would be met with a formal declaration of war. The German army consequently launched its invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. The United Kingdom and France declared war on Hitler's Germany 2 days later. The commencement of the Second World War had occurred. Göth was immediately engaged in combat. He was assigned to the SS combat unit Sturmbahn *111th at the onset of hostilities. On March 9, 1940, Himmler elevated him to the position of Verwaltungsführer, which corresponds to the administrative leader of a Sonderkommando or special unit. These units would become pivotal in the Nazis' war atrocities in the near future. Göth, who had served for a number of months as the administrative leader in Upper Silesia, Poland, was subsequently promoted to the rank of technical sergeant and assigned to Katowice or Katowice, also in Upper Silesia. Situated along the Czech frontier in western Poland, this region held considerable industrial importance for the Nazi regime due to its substantial coal and iron production. As a result, a strategy was devised in the early stages of the war to deport or otherwise remove a significant portion of the population in order to effectively colonize the area with German settlers. As a financial officer and administrator in the office of the Reich Commissioner for the Consolidation of German Nationhood in 1941, Göth participated in this endeavor. His ardent dedication to this endeavor was acknowledged when his commanding officer awarded him a certificate of service, which lauded both his service and his devotion to Nazi ideology. Irrespective of the acknowledgement of his contribution to Katowice, or possibly as a consequence of it, Göth's subsequent utilization was notably distinct. The Nazi regime adopted a more ruthless stance towards the Jewish community following the advent of war. The persecution of the Jewish population by the Nazis commenced in the 1930s. This persecution involved a series of anti-Semitic laws that resulted in the denial of citizenship to Jews and targeted assaults on Jewish enterprises. However, what followed the outbreak of the conflict was far more dire. An unfolding policy of forcible exile was at this time. Since then, pogroms and murders against Jews have escalated, and the Jews of Central Europe, and the enormous Jewish population in Poland in particular, have been subjected to brutality until they consent to withdraw from the Nazi Reich. Furthermore, the situation became even more radical as the war effort grew. The Germans conquered Denmark and Norway in the spring of 1940, and France and the Low Countries shortly thereafter. The Nazis began to contemplate the possibility of mass forced deportations or even massacres of the Jewish people, tens of thousands of whom were being rounded up and forced into Jewish ghettos, and a network of concentration camps being constructed throughout Central and Eastern Europe, after they had largely established their dominance over continental Europe. Before entering Western Poland, Göth would have been intimately acquainted with the camp system. In contrast, the situation became even more ominous in late 1941 and early 1942, when the Nazi regime decided to start gassing hundreds or thousands of Jews daily and burning their corpses promptly in concentration camps across Europe. In the summer of 1941, Hitler and the other leaders of the Reich implemented the final solution. In January 1942, information regarding its implementation was communicated to a conference of senior Nazi administrators at Wannsee, located outside of Berlin. Göth became immediately entangled in this malevolent endeavor. During the summer of that year, he was reassigned to the eastern Polish city of Lublin, where he was employed under the Austrian Nazi Odilo Globachnik. Globachnik assumed a prominent position in the construction and expansion of 3 concentration camps, namely Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Additionally, he oversaw the apprehension and transport of hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews to these camps, which later emerged as some of the most abhorrent sites of the Holocaust. In the months that followed, Göth adopted the methods of Globachnik, which included a startling degree of corruption and extreme brutality towards the Polish Jews who were being transported to these centers. Globachnik exploited the camp inmates as human slave labor and appropriated a substantial portion of the revenues generated by their labor for his personal gain. Göth would eventually adopt these practices for himself. Again, on February 11, 1943, Göth was promoted. It was a significant ascent. Effectively, he was to be appointed commandant or administrator of a newly constructed concentration camp in Kraków-Plaszow, situated on the premises of a smaller labor camp that had already been established there. He was predicated on his reputation. The Jewish inhabitants of Kraków had already dubbed Göth the Bloody Dog of Lublin prior to his arrival, and his conduct at his new station would more than merit that moniker. Göth was immediately tasked with overseeing the construction of the camp on a 200-acre site, which, to add insult to injury, was being constructed directly over 2 Jewish cemeteries. In order to accomplish this objective, the Jewish ghetto in Kraków was extinguished on March 13, 1943. The surviving Jewish prisoners were transferred to the new camp to serve as slave laborers. However, a considerable portion of the ghetto inmates met their demise there or were transported to one of the death camps. The facility was expeditiously established at Kraków-Plaszow with the assistance of the newcomers, and it was entirely operational within a matter of weeks. Following its conclusion, Göth delivered a speech to the camp's occupants in which he menacingly declared, "I am your God." Although Kraków-Plaszow was not a major hub of the Holocaust, it did account for the mass execution of hundreds of thousands of Roma people, Soviet prisoners of war, and other undesirable groups that the Nazis sought to eradicate throughout Europe between 1941 and 1945. The differentiation resided in the principal extermination camps, namely Auschwitz-Birkenau in western Poland and Treblinka, where gassing claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of individuals. In the case of Auschwitz-Birkenau alone, exceeded 1 million. In contrast, Kraków-Plaszow functioned exclusively as a concentration camp, supplying slave labor and housing individuals for designated durations prior to their transportation to Auschwitz or one of the other death camps. Gas chambers and crematoriums were absent from this location, in contrast to the more notorious execution camps. Kraków-Plaszow served as more than just a transit stop for Polish Jews en route to Auschwitz. It also manufactured products and supplies for the German war effort and the civilian population residing in Germany. In all of this, Göth was an especially sadistic administrator. When coordinating the transportation of trainloads of Jewish children from the camps to Auschwitz, he referred to them as kindergarten students. Nevertheless, this does not imply that there were no fatalities in Kraków-Plaszow. In fact, tens of thousands perished in that location. A significant portion of these fatalities were attributable to the deplorable conditions prevalent in the camp, which facilitated the spread of diseases like typhus. Others perished as a result of both malnutrition and excessive labor. The Jewish detainees were provided with a meager daily ration of a few hundred calories, which was predominantly composed of stale bread and watery soup. When this insufficient dietary regimen was coupled with a rigorous daily labor schedule ranging from 10 to 14 hours of strenuous effort, the inmates could only endure for a limited period of time before their physical well-being rapidly declined. A subset of individuals consented to work as guardians for the camp administration in an effort to obtain an additional ration of food. A greater percentage of the fatalities, nevertheless, at Kraków-Plaszow could be attributed to sheer savagery. Any act of disobedience to the camp's regulations, attempt to escape, or infraction may lead to an immediate execution. The majority of the time, these were executed in a staged fashion with the intention of terrorizing the camp's occupants by exposing them to the systematic shooting of those who had disobeyed the rules or failed to put forth sufficient effort. At the heart of this heinousness was Amon Göth, who frequently directed mass executions to serve as a model for the entire camp. Subsequent testimony from others indicated that he frequently discovered motives to shoot individuals before consuming their breakfast. During the day, when Göth was frequently inebriated, he would lead his 2 canines, Rolf, a Great Dane, and Ralph, an Alsatian, on a savagery-trained assault course through the camp. At times, gunfire was directed from the window of Göth's residence, situated in the heart of the camp, towards laborers whom he had perceived to be operating at an excessively sluggish pace. Göth ensured that all members of a work team were held accountable for any offense committed by one individual. In one particularly heinous instance, he eliminated every fifth member of a team from which one person had evidently fled. On Hujoa Gorka, a sizable hill within the camp, these executions occurred frequently. It is estimated that between 8,000 and 12,000 individuals were executed during the roughly 18 months that Göth ruled Kraków Plazzo, or approximately 20 per day. Unsurprisingly, the camp inmates attempted to conceal themselves frequently whenever Göth traversed the camp, as he inspired such fear. Later, a survivor provided testimony stating, "When you saw Göth, you saw death." Throughout Göth's tenure at Lublin and initial months at Kraków Plazzo, the overall war endeavors of Germany and its allies were deteriorating. Hitler decided to abandon the campaign he had launched the year prior against Great Britain, which aimed to coerce the country into surrendering via a naval blockade and a massive bombardment campaign in the summer of 1941. Conversely, the Nazis redirected their attention eastward and launched an invasion of the Soviet Union. Initially, the Eastern Front conflict was extraordinarily successful. By late autumn, the Wehrmacht had captured enormous swaths of territory in Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia and had advanced towards Moscow and Leningrad. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, contemplated agreeing to a peace treaty with Germany in which he ceded a substantial portion of this captured territory. However, he abstained from doing so, and the German advance was halted as the harsh Russian winter set in, causing hundreds of thousands of men to begin to perish. The impasse was resolved in the autumn and winter of 1942 with a decisive victory in the southern city of Stalingrad, as the Russians began to retreat in 1942. The Germans were pushed westward by the Russians in 1943. Furthermore, the United States commenced hostilities in December 1941, and the Western Allies overcame the Germans and Italians in North Africa during the course of 1943 before establishing the Southern Front in Europe in Italy. The Nazis were now assured of defeat. The involvement of Oskar Schindler in the activities of Amon Göth at Kraków Plazzo and the camp as a whole may be more widely recognized today. Schindler, a German industrialist from the Sudetenland region, had a turbulent early adulthood, characterized by multiple arrests for public intoxication in the early 1930s and a sporadic employment pattern. During the mid-1930s, he joined the Nazi movement in Czechoslovakia and provided information to the organization as it sought to expand its sphere of influence in the Sudetenland. His responsibilities as a party intelligence officer persisted subsequent to the annexation of the Sudetenland. In 1939, as a compensation for his party membership, he was appointed to an enamelware factory in Kraków. It was in this capacity that he participated in the activities that transpired at the Kraków Pshay concentration camp. Beginning in the early 1940s, as the number of Polish Jews detained and imprisoned increased, Schindler's factory was consistently staffed with Jewish slave laborers from the camp. Therefore, it is ironic that the very person who would ultimately rescue a significant number of Jews from Kraków Pshay was a long-standing Nazi. Through the 1993 Steven Spielberg film, Schindler indirectly gained notoriety for orchestrating the rescue of an estimated 1,200 Jewish detainees from Kraków Plazzo, and possibly many more. Despite employing Jewish labor in his Kraków factory, he did not subject his employees to deplorable treatment, unlike the majority of factory proprietors during the Reich. Indeed, he was particularly benevolent towards them, as he allocated substantial portions of his personal earnings and amassed wealth from the factory to procure commodities and provisions from the underground market, with the intention of providing better sustenance and care for the employees and their families. Above all, he made an effort to preserve the lives of hundreds of individuals. This was frequently achieved through the scheme of bribing SS officers stationed within the camp in order to deter them from executing laborers or transferring them to Auschwitz or any other death camp. Subsequently, as the Russians advanced towards Poland and a determination was reached to initiate a reduction in the scale of Kraków Plazzo, Schindler managed to persuade Göth to grant him permission to relocate his factory and its workforce to Branik, Czechoslovakia. Göth consented out of economic necessity. However, Schindler interpreted this as ensuring the survival of approximately 1,200 Jewish camp detainees, the names of whom he purportedly appended to a list that did not exist. With the gradual demise of Kraków-Plaszow, it is highly probable that these individuals would have been executed or deported to one of the extermination camps by this point in time. Despite mounting terror at Kraków-Plaszow, Schindler successfully completed his heroic endeavors. By mid-1944, the camp had experienced its most substantial growth in population. Initially accommodating around 2,000 inmates, it attained a zenith of approximately 25,000 individuals, with the supervision of around 630 guards. Furthermore, during this period, the Holocaust in Central and Eastern Europe was at its height of intensity. A significant portion of the 150,000 Jewish individuals who passed through Kraków-Plaszow en route to the extermination camps were transported through this location during the spring, summer, and fall of 1944. Furthermore, Göth's conduct persisted in evoking a sense of apprehension throughout the entire camp. Their morning parades had become an everyday occurrence. Göth fatally shot a man one morning for being too tall. He urinated on him as he lay expiring after that. On occasion, prisoners would evade executions but endure severe whippings as punishment for their lack of diligence. Joseph Bau, a prisoner who later reflected on the situation, described Göth as an abhorrent and terrible creature that instilled in people a fear of death, directed the camp towards acts of cruelty that defied the understanding of a compassionate mind. As the war approached its conclusion, the brutal activities at Kraków-Plaszow intensified. The Russians were making progress into Poland by mid-1944. In an effort to align themselves with the Allies, the Italian allies of Adolf Hitler denounced their leader, Benito Mussolini, and established a new government in Rome. A mission dispatched by Hitler to central Italy quickly rescued Mussolini, and in northern Italy, a pro-German administration was quickly established, sparking a civil war on the Italian southern front. Subsequent to the D-Day landings in Normandy, the Western Allies, commanded by the United States and Britain, initiated a long-awaited Western Front in France in the summer of 1944. Canada and other nations provided substantial support for this endeavor. Following these landings in the late summer and autumn of 1944, Paris and a number of other key cities in the Low Countries were liberated. As winter 1944 approached, the Western Allies were making preparations for their final offensive into Western Germany, while the Russians initiated their military buildup in Poland in anticipation of an April 1945 attack on Berlin. During the summer and autumn of 1944, as the Russians continued their westward advance, the settlements in eastern Poland commenced the process of being demolished and wound down. For example, Göth transported 7,500 Jewish women to Auschwitz on August 6, 1944, and over 4,500 Jewish males to the Mauthausen concentration camp within 4 days. As a result, the camp's population was reduced by approximately half. Nevertheless, Göth had already left Kraków-Plaszow prior to its complete closure. By the summer of 1944, the SS had initiated an investigation into his management of the camp. Göth, notwithstanding his purported allegiance to the Nazi cause, had been substantially benefiting from his position as commandant of Kraków-Plaszow. Operating a slave labor camp presented a substantial financial opportunity. Extensive quantities of products manufactured in factories, if siphoned off and sold clandestinely, could yield substantial financial gains. Furthermore, upon their arrival at any of the concentration centers, prisoners were typically deprived of their remaining belongings. Subsequent to occasional discoveries, senior camp administrators would frequently assert ownership over valuable jewelry and timepieces crafted of gold and silver. Such profit opportunities were utilized in the majority of programs. Amon Göth, like many others, capitalized on his tenure as commandant at Kraków-Plaszow. He had been amassing wealth and merchandise since the spring of 1943, frequently transporting them to his family and children in Vienna or the publishing house owned by his parents. As the camp's imminent dismantlement in 1944 became more apparent, this frenzy intensified. Schindler's ability to persuade Göth to permit the westward migration of his factory and employees into Czechoslovakia was in part due to the pretext that this action would provide Göth with to ship some of the goods he had acquired westward. The SS authorities were duly informed regarding this tainted endeavor committed by Göth. It was accompanied by accounts of Göth and his mistress Ruth Irene Calder hosting wild drinking parties at the camp and exhibiting excessive brutality towards the captives. The latter course of action received no humanitarian criticism. It was widely held that Göth should not have been responsible for the deaths of healthy laborers who were still fit to be used as slave labor. The cumulative effect of these allegations was his dismissal from the rank of Commandant of Kraków Plazo on September 13, 1944. He was returned to Berlin for prosecution, but in the winter of 1944, as the war effort grew increasingly desperate, the charges against him were withdrawn and he was released. Having oversaw the growth of the Kraków Plazo camp and its darkest days in 1943 and 1944, Göth was now approaching its demise. Following the departure of Göth, SS Obersturmführer Arnold Buscher assumed command of the camp. Commencing in the summer of 1944, Göth had initiated mass deportations. Buscher continued this practice until the camp had a mere few thousand inmates and guards by the beginning of winter 1944. The ultimate frenzy of activity revolved around the exhumation of the mortal remains of the tens of thousands of people who had been executed within the camp throughout Göth's tumultuous reign. The remains of these were looted and incinerated in massive pyres. During the final months of 1944, visual representations of SS officers endeavoring to eradicate traces of the mass homicides that had transpired in the concentration camps were prevalent across Eastern and Central Europe. The camp administrators, who were few in number, obtained information in January 1945 that the Soviets were nearing Kraków. As a result, they evacuated and dismantled the remaining camp structures. As the Soviets arrived in Kraków Plazo on January 20, 1945, they discovered negligible indications of a concentration camp, in contrast to other camps that had been discovered alongside substantial quantities of prisoners, structures, fences, and guard towers. During this time, Göth was in a state of extensive mobility throughout Central Europe. After the charges against him were dismissed and he was granted his release, Göth's principal objective was to safeguard the illicit funds he had amassed through his shady transactions at Kraków Plazo. Consequently, he embarked on a journey throughout Central Europe in the early spring of 1945 in search of substantial shipments of products that had been dispatched from eastern Poland. A visit was paid to the new factory of Oskar Schindler in Czechoslovakia with the intention of retrieving some of the items that had been transported there during the factory's relocation. Nevertheless, while attempting to carry out these endeavors, Göth became ailing and was initially admitted to a hospital for chronic stomach problems. However, he was later transferred to an SS medical facility, where he was officially declared mentally unfit. Consequently, in the late spring of 1945, Göth was confined to a mental institution in Bavaria, the very location from which he had been in exile for a decade prior. He was present to observe the concluding phases of the conflict. In the winter of 1944, the Second World War in Europe had entered its final stages. The Western Allies were assembling forces in Belgium, Luxembourg, and northeast France in anticipation of a significant assault into Western Germany in the late winter as the snow began to fall in December. A final major drive by Hitler to counterattack into the Bastogne region resulted in brief setbacks for the Allies in January 1945. However, the Battle of the Bulge concluded in Allied victory. Furthermore, the reallocation of resources from the Eastern Front to Western Germany, where a portion of Germany's final divisions were stationed in an effort to launch a counteroffensive, resulted in the Russians' rapid expansion into northeast Germany and northwest Poland during the initial months of 1945. For the Allies, the race to Berlin had begun. Upon their early arrival, the Russian forces initiated the besiege of the city during the spring of 1945. Hitler, finally surrounded and reluctant to surrender, committed suicide on April 30, 1945, in the Reich Chancellery bunker. The day after, his successor as chief of the Nazi state, Joseph Goebbels, emulated his predecessor. A precise 1 week subsequent to that, Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the Wehrmacht, ascended to power and formally surrendered Germany, thereby concluding the war in Europe. As a result of the war's aftermath, Göth was marked. Amid the German occupation, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia reached a consensus in late 1944 and early 1945 that an overabundance of retribution should not be exacted against the German people. A considerable number of Germans were merely unwitting observers of a regime that had come to power in 1933 with support of less than 1/3 of the nation. Furthermore, it is worth noting that the majority of individuals who served in the Wehrmacht from 1939 to 1945 were young males who had either been conscripted or had demonstrated only a minimal degree of commitment to the Nazi ideology. Even fewer individuals were found culpable of actual war crimes or the most heinous atrocities linked to the regime. Nevertheless, this clemency would be restricted in scope. Leaders of the German government and those responsible for war crimes were to face severe prosecution. However, the SS, of which Göth was a senior member, was to be held fully accountable for their actions, as the most ideological branch of the Nazi Party and the organization that oversaw the concentration camps and the mass murder of millions of Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and other political dissenters. Göth, therefore, would face legal action if apprehended. It was not long before he was apprehended. No attempt was made to flee or evade capture. The former commandant of Krakow Plazo was apprehended by the United States military while he was still incarcerated in a Bavarian mental institution. As an attempt to conceal his status as a senior SS officer, Göth had donned the uniform of an ordinary rank-and-file German soldier. Consequently, he was not promptly apprehended as an individual subject to prosecution for war crimes. Instead, he was transferred to the nearby Dachau concentration camp, which the Allies had repurposed as a detention facility for German soldiers pending charges. Göth was ultimately recognized by Joseph Yevkovich at this location. Yevkovich had encountered Göth in early 1943, when the Krakow-Pashay camp was undergoing its initial expansion subsequent to Göth's arrival, several years earlier. Göth had once pointed his gun at the cranium of the adolescent Yevkovich at that time. Göth's survival was contingent upon a Jewish police officer assaulting the adolescent and subsequently instructing him to conserve his cartridge in light of Yevkovich's demise. At this moment, almost 3 years have passed since the man who nearly murdered him was identified. After the Allies ascertained his identity, Göth was promptly extradited to Poland to face legal charges. In 1946, Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz for a significant portion of the Holocaust, accompanied Göth to Poland. During the principal war crimes trial in Nuremberg, Germany, the major surviving leaders of the Nazi regime, including Hermann Göring, Albert Speer, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, were being tried. However, it was the responsibility of those who operated concentration camps on Polish soil and were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens, including Höss and Göth, to be tried in Poland. As a consequence, the prosecution of Göth was initiated in Warsaw on August 27, 1946. It was only 10 days long. The Göth who appeared in court was not the same individual who had been apprehended in Germany the previous year. As the war progressed, he gained a substantial amount of weight and consumed copious amounts of alcohol while supervising the camp at Krakow Plazo. His admission to a mental institution in the final days of the conflict is sufficient confirmation of the shattered condition of his mind in early 1945. However, upon entering the courtroom in Warsaw, he regained his composure and vowed to personally defend himself and cross-examine witnesses. Nevertheless, from the outset, it was indisputable that Göth would receive a guilty verdict. In fact, he was explicitly charged in the indictment with the murder of a minimum of 8,000 individuals in Krakow Plazo and other locations, including the Krakow ghetto. Throughout the course of 10 days, the prosecution questioned 70 witnesses, the majority of whom testified in Göth's actions at Kraków Plazo and elsewhere in a damning manner. In contrast to Höss, who candidly acknowledged his involvement in the events at Auschwitz during his trial, but defended his actions by asserting that he was merely carrying out orders, Göth persistently sought to refute the veracity of the allegations leveled against him. One of his arguments was that individuals caught in possession of explosives were the only ones subjected to shooting at the camp. Everything was inconsequential, and the few individuals Göth summoned as witnesses in his defense merely corroborated the statements of prosecution witnesses regarding his brutality. It came as no surprise when the court found Göth guilty of all allegations and sentenced him to death by hanging on September 5. The execution occurred within a span of merely 8 days. On September 13, 1946, he was executed by hanging on the premises of the Kraków Plazo labor camp. Subsequently, his remains were cremated and the pulverized remains were deposited in the Vistula River. 2 surviving offspring and his spouse survived him. Annie Göth had previously filed for separation. Through his adultery with Ruth Calder, he also fathered an illegitimate child named Monica Hertwig. Prior to her suicide in 1983, Ruth Calder continued to defend Göth and his actions for decades. However, how is the binary antithesis of Göth in Kraków Plazo? Oskar Schindler was a post-war fugitive for a limited period of time. Certain Jewish individuals whose lives he had preserved composed letters endorsing his deeds, which he intended to transport with him but feared would fall into the hands of the Russians. He departed westward with only the garments on his back, having previously squandered the entirety of his factory's profits on bribes and products from the black market. In due course, he and his spouse arrived at the American borders, where they negotiated a pardon. Despite establishing themselves in Bavaria during the autumn of 1945, Schindler endured a considerably turbulent remainder of his life. After experiencing a series of business setbacks, he and his wife immigrated to Argentina in 1949. However, they subsequently returned to Germany apart following his bankruptcy in 1958. Despite facing additional insolvency in Germany in 1963, a heart attack, and persistent poor health thereafter, Schindler managed to sustain himself primarily through contributions from a number of the Jewish individuals whose lives he had previously spared and with whom he had maintained relationships. Following his demise in October 1974, his remains were transported to Jerusalem, where they were interred on Mount Zion. No other individual exhibited a more pronounced contrast than Amon Göth. Merol Amon Göth was among the most heinous senior and mid-ranking SS and Nazi regime members. Perhaps what is noteworthy about this is the scarcity of indications during his youth regarding the severity of his tenure as commandant of Kraków Plazo. Early in life, as the sole offspring of affluent parents who managed a thriving publishing house in Vienna, he displayed a rebellious disposition, but few explicit signs of brutality. While his political stances progressively became more extreme over time, he did not exhibit overtly violent behavior during the latter part of the 1920s. Similarly, his terrorist activities in the 1930s can be classified as acts of direct political violence rather than manifestations of pure sadism. Indeed, he worked for the family business for considerable durations between 1934 and 1937, and for nearly 3 years during that time, he essentially withdrew from the SS and ceased to be an active member of the organization. Subsequently, upon the outbreak of war, he assumed a succession of primarily administrative positions before being relocated to the eastern region to join an expanding network of officials tasked with deporting or enslaving the Jews of Poland or arranging for their labor in slave camps. During the early 1940s, Amon, who had already become ideologically radical, developed the brutal nature that would come to define his reign in Kraków Plazo. In Poland, he witnessed his immediate superiors, including Odilo Globachnik, terrorize the Jewish people under their immense authority at the time. As a result, Göth's sojourns in Katowice and Lublin served as an eerie training ground for him to acquire the barbarism that he later employed at Kraków Plazo. During this period, he subjected thousands of Jewish prisoners to dehumanizing treatment, including arbitrary murder, torture, and physical abuse. Every individual was profoundly psychologically traumatized by Göth's volatile aggression. However, his rule in Kraków Plazzo further demonstrates the duplicity of the SS's highest command. Prior to the complete dismantling of Kraków Plazzo, its commandant was apprehended for personally benefiting substantially from the camp's operations, as opposed to transferring the camp's earnings to the Nazi regime in Berlin. Furthermore, his rule acquired a more somber tone when juxtaposed with the heroic deeds of Oskar Schindler and his endeavors to rescue the greatest number of Jews residing in Kraków Plazzo. What is your assessment of Amon Göth? Does a portion of his behavior make sense if he was in fact psychologically deranged the entire time, or if he was more of an ideological Nazi devoted to the xenophobic policies of the Third Reich? Kindly provide your feedback in the remark section. Until then, we appreciate your attention.